Okay, we're back down with a legal blow for President Trump in federal court. A judge ordering that writer Jean Carroll should immediately receive the more than $5 billion she's owed after a jury found President Trump liable for sexual abuse and defamation. That order coming despite the president's demand for a delay. NBC News legal analyst Danny Savalos joins us now. So, Danny, the president's legal team filed another appeal minutes after the judge's order. Is there a real shot of blocking the payment, or is this a game plan just to kind of delay?
No, not really. In all likelihood, I should say that the odds of getting any kind of reconsideration at the Supreme Court or any relief at the district court are next to none. Trump's argument is essentially, yes, we agreed if cert was denied, if the Supreme Court denied to hear my case, that would be it. The funds would be released. But technically, as long as we're still asking the high court to reconsider, as long as we're still fighting, this appeal is still live, and therefore the funds should not be released from escrow.
Welcome, people. Dr. John is here. So what just happened, Gius, is insane. Inside the Pentagon, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth is at the center of an alarming story that has career military officials genuinely frightened. The situation involving institutional direction and leadership has consequences that could show up in the worst possible way. And most people aren't even watching. So here is the core of it, the central fact that everything else revolves around. In the last year and a half, more than 24 senior military officers have been removed from their positions inside the Pentagon. 24. Let that number really land. These are not low-level guys, not middle managers, not people whose departure barely registers on the institutional radar. These are generals. These are admirals. People who spent decades serving this country.
And then on that point, Carroll is owed more money for another case against the president. Will that cash be held up in appeals too?
In all likelihood, probably not. And I say that because the Trump team is making some creative last-minute arguments, but their arguments really amount to saying after a court essentially gives a final order. Because here, this has been the rule for centuries now. Once your case gets to the Supreme Court, they either deny your opportunity to be heard, called denying cert, or they choose to hear it. But either way, if they deny cert, that is the end of the case. Trump's team is saying, well, technically the court could decide to reconsider its own decision not to hear this case. So technically, all this stuff is still alive. It's sort of part of the Trump playbook of legally fight until the bitter end, which, is either a bug or a feature, depending on how you look at it.
Okay, Danny Savalos for us from London tonight. Danny, great to have you on. We appreciate you being here.
People who went through combat deployments, advanced military schools, years and years of earning their way up through the chain of command, surviving every cut, every promotion board, every competitive selection process that the military uses to identify its best and brightest. And they are being pushed out, not because they failed on the battlefield, not because they made tactical errors, not because they were caught doing something wrong or violating some ethical standard. According to former officers who have now gone on the record with major news organizations, they were pushed out because they questioned Hegseth's decisions. That is it. They asked a question. They raised a concern.
All right, turning now to a major legal loss for the president tonight. A federal appeals court upholding writer Jean Carroll's $83.3 million judgment against Trump. The court rejecting the Trump legal team argument that he was protected by presidential immunity. Back in January of 2024, Trump was found liable of defaming the writer's reputation when he denied her rape claim. Joining us now is NBC News legal analyst and a good friend of Top Story, Misty Maris. Misty, so great to see you. I guess my first question is, does the president have another chance, or is this it?
Well, it's going to go to the Supreme Court, Tom, or at least that's what the president is going to ask. Because this is a typical civil case. Obviously, it was unusual because it involved Donald Trump. But it's not the type of legal issues that you generally see go to the Supreme Court, except the immunity decision. Remember, landmark decision in 2024 came out, identified where presidential immunity applies, and that's an open question as far as what it means for civil cases for a president.
What do you think is going to happen? Do you have any idea in the Supreme Court?
Well, I think the Supreme Court...
Will they take it up first?
I think there's a likelihood that they will take it up because of that very issue.
They did exactly what senior officers are supposed to do what the military has trained them to do for their entire careers. And then they were gone. Come on, are you kidding me? You cannot run a military like that. You just cannot. The military is not a private corporation where the CEO gets to fire anyone who disagrees with them. It is a complex, hierarchical institution that depends on honest communication, on the free flow of professional advice from experienced officers to civilian leadership. And the fact that this is happening right now with barely any national attention should be making a lot more noise than it is. Now, here is where it starts to get really heavy.
Remember, this relates back to some tweets. He was the president. It was 2019. And those could fall into one of those buckets. Certainly not an official act. But remember, there's an intermediate bucket, perimeter activity, as well as personal conduct, which would not have any immunity. So whether or not the Supreme Court takes it up, it would absolutely be a novel issue.
Remind our viewers, $83 million, that's a big sum of money. You know the president's going to be monitoring this and following this as well. Do we know why the damages were so high?
So $83 million is absolutely a tremendous amount of money, and it's broken down into two buckets. One is punitive damages, punishment, $65 million, and then 18.3 was for compensatory. That's to make someone who was harmed whole. Now, generally, these types of awards, they're challenged at appeal, and that's what we saw here. He wanted to knock that down, to reduce it. But the court upheld it, and they went and looked at his conduct, and they said it was particularly egregious, and they upheld that punitive damages award. The rule of thumb, Tom, is 3 times a compensatory award is generally upheld. I won't make you do the math on the spot. This is about 3.6. So it's on that high side. There was an argument
where the abstract concern about personnel changes becomes something much more concrete and disturbing. One removed admiral speaking to a major news outlet said it plainly and directly. He said, Hegseth is focused on politics, not personnel. Think about what that means for a second. The Secretary of Defense, the person responsible for the safety and effectiveness of the most powerful military on earth, is reportedly more concerned with political loyalty than with getting the right people into the right jobs. And the people saying this aren't random critics sitting on Twitter throwing takes. These are people who wore the uniform. People who gave decades of their lives to the institution Hegseth is now running.
That it was unconstitutional, but the court looked at the conduct and said, this is the type of conduct that warrants that award.
And the kind of language that he used during the court case and afterwards, basically saying she's too unattractive for him to have done anything to her, what she was claiming. Did the appeals court also look at that language? I mean, was that factored into their decision?
It was, and that was exactly what the appeals court looked at to say whether or not this is the type of case that warrants an award of that magnitude for those punishment damages, Tom, because that's what punitive damages are. They're for punishment, and there are factors that the court is going to look at to say whether or not that board is unconstitutional.
How long do we know till the Supreme Court may take this up? How long? Because the longer they have to wait, right, the president doesn't have to pay out E. Jean Carroll.
Right. So now Carroll won. Remember, there's 2 E. Jean Carroll cases.
Right.
That one also was up on appeal. He was not successful. $5 million award on that one. Still waiting to see if the Supreme Court will take it up. Now that this one has gone through the next steps of the appellate process, I imagine they're going to take up both or none. And so we'll see what happens.
And we'll know that in the coming weeks, or I mean, not weeks,
could
but months.
Longer. Yeah, could take longer.
Okay, Misty, so great to have you on. Always good to see you.
Tom.
Thank you.
Veterans, officers, people who know what a well-functioning military looks like from the inside and who are now raising the alarm loud enough that it cannot be ignored. And yeah, that should worry every single person in this country, no matter which party you vote for, no matter where you stand politically. This one cuts across all of that. This is not about left versus right. This is about whether the institution responsible for defending the country is being run in a way that actually makes it effective, or whether it is being hollowed out from the inside. And this is not some news story that just popped up this week. It has been building for a while, gradually accumulating weight and evidence. Reports going back to 2025 already showed that insiders inside the Pentagon were describing Hegseth as increasingly isolated from the people around him. Not connected, not collaborative, not open to feedback. And now the pressure has reached a new level. The criticism is no longer happening in whispers behind closed doors. It is out in the open. Veterans and retired officers are speaking publicly. They are going to major news organizations and saying on the record that his hardline approach is not about restoring military discipline, it is about political loyalty. And they are warning that what is happening right now inside that building is creating real chaos. The kind of chaos that does not just hurt morale, the kind that damages a military's ability to do its actual job, which is to defend the country effectively when called upon. So let's think about what that actually looks like on the ground, what the human reality of this institutional turmoil actually means. Imagine you are a general. You have spent 30 years climbing through the ranks. You have served in combat zones. You have trained your whole career to give honest, expert advice to civilian leadership. You have been in rooms where lives were on the line, and your assessment of the situation was the difference between a good plan and a catastrophic one. That is literally your job, your most important job. And now you are being told basically that if your honest advice does not align perfectly with what the boss wants to hear, you are out. What happens next? What happens to the quality of the advice going forward? What happens to the next general who has a concern? They stay quiet. They say what they are supposed to say. They tell the boss what the boss wants to hear. And then bad decisions get made. And then at some point down the line, those bad decisions have consequences. Yeah, that is the question hanging over all of this. And the answer is not a comfortable one, not even close. We are going to get into all of that. But first, you need to understand who Pete Hegseth actually is, why Trump picked him, and why this moment matters in a way that goes far beyond just Pentagon politics. Because this is not just a story about one man's management style. This is a story about what happens when loyalty becomes more important than competence inside the most powerful military institution in the world. The stakes here are as high as they get, so buckle up. This is wild. Okay, so let's set the scene here properly, because you need the full context to understand why this is different from your typical Washington controversy. Pete Hegseth took over as Secretary of Defense. And basically from day one, it was controversial, not just because of who he was before politics, but because of how he came into the job. His confirmation was one of the narrowest in modern history. He barely got through, and there were real concerns raised at the time, not just from Democrats, but from some Republicans as well, about whether he was truly ready for a position of that magnitude, a job that requires managing hundreds of thousands of people, coordinating with dozens of allied nations, overseeing a budget in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and making life or death decisions about the deployment of American military force. That is not a small job. And the concerns that existed before he was confirmed, they have not gone away, they have grown. And the people who raised them are now saying, "Told you so." Now, here's the thing most people miss about this story. The mainstream framing around Hegseth tends to split into two camps. Camp one says he is a Trump loyalist, cleaning house, getting rid of the old guard, restoring traditional military values that the previous administration had eroded. Camp two says he is dangerously unqualified and is trashing a functional institution out of ideological zeal. And both of those framings have some truth in them. But when you actually look at the specific details, when you dig into what the people who have been inside the Pentagon are actually saying, a much more complicated and honestly more troubling picture starts to emerge. And it is not one that fits neatly into either of those boxes. It is messier than that, and messier is usually where the real story lives. Let's start with the removals again, because the number itself is the anchor of this whole story. More than 24 senior military officers removed over roughly a year and a half. That is not normal. Let me say that again because it is important. That is not normal. Military leadership transitions happen. New administrations bring in new people. That is expected and fine. But this pace at this level of seniority goes well beyond a routine transition. When you are talking about generals and admirals, people who have climbed to the absolute top of the military's career ladder, removing them in these numbers sends shockwaves through an institution. And not just because of the people who leave. The people who stay are watching. They are learning the rules. They are figuring out what the new normal is. And the lesson being taught, according to the critics, is that the rule is simple. Agree with Hegseth or go home. That is it. That is the whole rule. Now, here's the part that should really make you stop and think. The officers who have spoken out, the ones going on the record to news organizations, are not describing situations where they made serious errors or acted improperly. They are describing situations where they raised legitimate professional concerns about military decisions through official channels, through the proper chain of command, and then found themselves out of a job shortly after. And I want to be really clear about why that matters. In a functioning military, that kind of honest professional dissent is not just allowed. It is required. It is how bad plans get fixed before they get implemented. It is how mistakes get caught before they become catastrophes. When you shut that down, when you create a culture where disagreement equals removal, you are not running a tighter ship. You are actually making the ship much more likely to hit an iceberg. Are you kidding me? And they know it. That is exactly why the veterans are speaking out, because they understand what it costs when honest feedback gets silenced inside an institution like this. And the concern goes deeper than just the individual officers who got pushed out. The alarm being raised is about what their removal does to the institution more broadly. Military readiness. And I know that sounds like a policy term, but stay with me here. Military readiness is basically the thing that determines whether the United States can respond effectively when something bad happens in the world. It is the combination of training, morale, leadership quality, equipment, logistics, and about 100 other factors that go into whether a military force can actually do what it is supposed to do when the moment comes. And when you have veterans and retired military leaders saying publicly that the Pentagon is in chaos, that morale is suffering, that the best and most experienced senior officers are being driven out, they are not talking about abstract policy debates. They are talking about the readiness of the force. And that matters to every single American, whether they realize it or not. Here is another layer to this whole thing. Hegseth has framed his entire approach as a correction. He came in saying the military had become bloated and bureaucratic. He said it had been affected by what he called left-wing ideology. He said his job was to restore discipline and military effectiveness. And look, there are people in this country who genuinely believe that framing and who welcome those words. That is a real political constituency and a real point of view. And we are not here to dismiss it. But the critics, and again, these are not liberal protesters, these are retired generals, these are combat veterans, these are career military professionals. They are saying the reality inside the Pentagon looks nothing like that frame. They are saying what Hegseth is actually running is not a discipline restoration, it is a political loyalty operation. And there is a massive difference between those two things. A massive one. Think about it this way. If you genuinely want to improve military discipline and effectiveness, you keep the people who are the best at their jobs, the ones with the most experience, the ones with the sharpest operational thinking, even if some of them have views you find annoying. Because military effectiveness is not a matter of political opinion. It is a matter of expertise. But if your actual goal is political loyalty, if what you really want is a military leadership that agrees with you and reflects your worldview, then you remove the people who push back. And the critics are saying that is exactly what is happening. That the rollback of diversity policies and the culture war framing around it has been used as cover for a much broader purge of anyone who doesn't fit the political mold. And that has consequences that go well beyond personnel decisions. Consequences that affect how this country defends itself. Let's talk about the speech for a moment because it is a really revealing piece of this story. Hegseth made a speech to a room full of generals and admirals, and the reaction from veterans who heard about it was sharp. They called it insulting. They called it egotistical. They called it dangerous. Now, those are very strong words. These are people who are accustomed to direct, hard-edged military communication. They are not the kind of people who use language like that lightly. So when experienced veterans describe a speech from the Secretary of Defense in those terms, that tells you something significant about the tone Hegseth is setting inside the institution. This was not a moment that got lost in the noise. It was a moment that genuinely rattled people who have spent their entire careers inside this world. And they are still talking about it. And here's the through line that connects all of these pieces together. The removals, the isolation, the speech, the culture inside the Pentagon that insiders are describing, it all comes back to the same question. Who is Pete Hegseth actually working for? Is he working for the military? Is he working for the national security of the United States? Or is he primarily working to prove his loyalty to the Trump White House? Because the criticism from inside and outside the Pentagon is not just that his specific policies are wrong. The deeper criticism, the one that really stings, is that his entire operation inside the Defense Department has been organized around one overriding priority, demonstrating that he is a reliable enforcer for the administration. And critics say that is a fundamental misunderstanding, or maybe a deliberate rejection of what the Secretary of Defense is actually supposed to be doing. And then there is the isolation problem, which deserves its own moment. Reports from inside the Pentagon are describing Hegseth as cut off, not integrated into the expert networks that surround him, not listening to people who might complicate his worldview. And for someone in that job, isolation is one of the most dangerous conditions imaginable. The Secretary of Defense is not supposed to be a lone operator. That role requires processing input from intelligence officials, from combat commanders, from logistics experts, from diplomats, from allied nations, from a constant flood of competing assessments and recommendations. If you are shutting that out, if you are surrounding yourself only with people who tell you what you want to hear, you are flying blind. And in the Department of Defense, flying blind does not just mean you make bad policy. It means people die. That is the stakes we are talking about here. So we have the removals, we have the politics over personnel charge from a removed admiral, we have veterans calling Hegseth's speech insulting and dangerous, we have reports of growing isolation, we have more than a year of insiders describing chaos inside the building, and now the story is breaking into the open. The question is, what happens from here? And that is exactly what we are going to break down right now. All right, so let's break this all the way down because there is a lot going on here and it is easy to get overwhelmed by the details. So let's talk about what actually matters, why it matters, and where this thing is likely to go from here. 4 points, clear and simple. The scale of what is happening inside the Pentagon is genuinely unprecedented. More than 24 senior military officers removed in roughly 18 months. Let that number sit for a second. We are not talking about mid-level managers being reassigned. We are talking about generals and admirals. The people at the absolute top of a career path that takes 30 years to climb. People who have been through multiple combat deployments, who have managed enormous organizations, who have been in rooms making decisions that affected the lives of thousands of American service members. And they are being removed at a pace that has alarmed veterans across the political spectrum. This is wild, and you should not let the political noise around it make you numb to how unusual this is, because it is unusual, historically unusual, and anyone who has spent time inside the military world will tell you the same thing. Now think about what that does to the institution as a whole. Every single person still inside the Pentagon is watching this happen. Every colonel who wants to make general someday. Every captain who aspires to admiral. Every mid-level officer who has built a career around providing honest professional military advice. They are all watching their most senior leaders get pushed out, and they are drawing the lesson. The lesson being taught, according to former officers who have gone on the record, is that the thing that got those generals and admirals removed was asking questions, raising concerns about Hegseth's decisions, doing the exact thing that good military officers are supposed to do. So what does the next generation of officers do with that lesson? They learn to stay quiet. They learn to agree. They learn that survival inside this Pentagon depends on loyalty, not on professional honesty. And that chilling effect does not just damage morale. It corrupts the entire information environment that military leaders depend on to make good decisions. And once that environment breaks down, it is incredibly hard to rebuild. The framing war around Hegseth matters because it is covering up the real story. And here is what I mean by that. The White House narrative around Hegseth frames everything he does as discipline restoration, cutting the bureaucracy, removing the ideologically compromised elements, rebuilding a fighting force from the ground up. And that narrative works well for a certain audience because it hits on themes that a lot of people find genuinely appealing. Who doesn't want a leaner, tougher, more effective military? Nobody's going to argue against that goal. But the critics, and look, I will keep saying this because it matters, the critics are not left-wing commentators. They are veterans. They are retired officers. They are people who have absolutely no interest in seeing the United States military weaken. And they are saying the actual story inside the Pentagon does not match that frame at all, not even close. What they are describing is a process that looks much more like a political purge than a competence-based restructuring. They are describing a Defense Department where the primary qualification for leadership has shifted away from military expertise toward demonstrated loyalty to the Trump administration. And that is a genuinely dangerous thing to do to a military because military effectiveness depends entirely on putting the most capable people in the most critical positions, regardless of their political views. The moment you change that standard, the moment the primary question becomes not, are you the best person for this job, but are you the right kind of person politically, you are corrupting the institution. And the veterans who are speaking out are saying that corruption is already underway. It has already started. And the longer it goes on, the harder it becomes to fix. Military readiness is not a talking point. It is the thing that actually matters in the end. And here is why the Hegseth story has stakes that go far beyond typical Washington drama. The United States military is not just an abstract symbol of American power. It is the actual mechanism by which this country responds to real threats in the real world. The decisions being made about who leads that military, what culture exists inside it, whether the best people are in the most critical jobs, those decisions have direct consequences for what happens when the next crisis comes. And look at the world right now. There is no shortage of potential crises. The Middle East, the Pacific, Europe, the list goes on and on. In that environment, the quality of the military's leadership is not a domestic political story. It is a national security story. Full stop. And what veterans and retired military professionals are saying, these are people who understand what military readiness actually requires, is that the trajectory right now is moving in the wrong direction. The officer purges are disruptive. The culture of loyalty over merit is corrosive. The isolation of the Secretary of Defense from honest professional feedback is dangerous. And the overall effect is to produce an institution that looks disciplined on the surface, but is actually less capable underneath. Come on, you cannot purge your way to a better military. Military effectiveness is built on trust, on honest communication, on the confidence that the best ideas will rise to the top, regardless of whether they are politically comfortable. When you replace that with a culture of fear and loyalty performance, you are undermining the very thing you claim to be restoring. And that is not an opinion. That is how institutions work, or rather how they stop working. The political stakes for the Trump administration around this story are real and growing. And here is why. The military is consistently one of the most trusted institutions in American public life. Polls year after year show that Americans have more confidence in the military than in almost any other institution in government. That trust is not abstract. It is based on the belief that the military is above partisan politics, that it exists to serve the country, not any particular administration. And stories about officer purges, about political loyalty tests inside the Pentagon, about veterans speaking out in alarm about the direction of military leadership, those stories do not just hit differently than your typical Washington controversy. They hit in a place where the Trump administration is genuinely vulnerable in a way that other controversies simply don't. Because here is the thing. The Trump coalition includes an enormous number of military veterans and military families, people who care deeply about the health of the armed forces, people who are not going to just accept the narrative that purging 24 senior officers is a sign of strength. Some of those people are the ones speaking out right now. And the more of them that go on the record, the harder it becomes to dismiss the story as politically motivated attacks from the left. When the people raising alarms are combat veterans, when they are retired generals and admirals, when they are people who spent their careers inside the institution they are now warning about, the political cover for defending Hegseth gets thinner and thinner. And the White House knows it. You can see it in how carefully they have tried to manage this story because they know exactly what it could become. So where does this go from here? A few things are worth watching. First, whether more former officers continue to speak out publicly. Every new voice on the record makes the story harder to dismiss and raises the pressure on the administration to respond with more than just loyalty defenses. Second, whether Congress starts to pay serious attention because congressional oversight of the Defense Department is a legitimate constitutional function, and the scale of what is being described here gives oversight-minded members of Congress a real hook to pull on. Third, and maybe most importantly, whether the effects on military readiness become visible in ways that are harder to ignore. Right now, the concern is largely expressed through the words of veterans and former officers. But if operational failures or recruitment problems or morale crises start to show up in data, the story gets a whole different kind of gravity and a whole lot more attention from people who had not been paying close enough attention before. The bottom line is this. Pete Hegseth walked into the Pentagon promising to restore it, to make it leaner, tougher, and more effective. And the people who have been watching from inside are now saying publicly that what is actually happening is the opposite. That 24 of the military's most experienced senior leaders have been pushed out. That a culture of political loyalty is replacing a culture of professional merit. That the Secretary of Defense is increasingly isolated from honest advice, and that all of it adds up to a military leadership picture that should worry every American who cares about national security, regardless of their politics. This is not a red team or blue team issue. This is an American issue.